All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in tonight to the MiddleGround Mic. We have a phenomenal guest tonight, Rick. And man, we were talking a little bit, and I've learned some things that I'm guessing without talking to you, I probably would have never learned in my life. Introduce yourself to everybody and tell them who you are.
Hello, Rick Lynch. I have written, I'm not sure if we're on video or not, but I've written this book, Money and Liberty: How the Framers' Obsession with protecting your money shaped the Constitution. And there it is, available everywhere: iPad, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I encourage you to buy it, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, just based on some of that, I mean, it's very, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it. Some of the things that you were talking about, I mean, almost really, some of this should be in like college courses or in high school. I
Yeah.
mean, like, and to me, that's just would be like step one of life.
Yeah. I thank you for that. I thank you very much. Thank you. I um I think there are at least three things in my book, and maybe a fourth, that and I don't like to talk this way, but I don't think that I've never in my life ever once met a human being who was aware of any of them. And if you don't know these things, you cannot understand the Constitution. You will never understand the Constitution, and you will get it 100% completely wrong. And we were talking about the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights is number one. Number two is how the framers, if you put the framers in a room and ask them what is the most important of all your rights, the most sacred, granted by God, a natural right, granted by God, not a civil right. What is the most important of those rights? Number three, why the Constitution was written, exactly what was happening in the United States of America in 1787 that led to the Constitutional Convention. Wow. If you knew what that was, it would blow your mind. And number four, just like the Bill of Rights, completely, totally misunderstood checks and balances system. Those are the four things in my book that you will find nowhere else on planet Earth, and they will blow your mind.
No, I mean, I am, especially learning about like how you put the framers and the founding fathers,
Hmm.
right? Because I mean, obviously there's a lot of,
Well,
obviously
that's
gray area with a lot of people. Well, not gray area for you because you know the difference, but to the common man, I guess is maybe the best way to say it. It is you know, it's a gray area.
yeah. Well, to me, that's the most minor of points I make, but it's fairly significant because I've read 10,000 books about the U.S. Constitution, including Robert Bork and including every modern day intellectual you could possibly name. All the bestsellers. It's a very, very minor point. But every single one of them, every one confuses the founders and the framers, which are two entirely separate, different groups.
Right.
The founding fathers, go to your Google machine, you'll see 6 names, 7, 8 names. Lists differ, sources differ, but these are men who were significant players in the founding of the country before, during, and after the Revolution. George Washington, Madison, John Adams, da da da. Founding fathers. The framers refers to the 55 men at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, period. Thomas Jefferson was not a framer. John Adams was not a framer. They were not at the convention. They were both founding fathers, but they were not framers. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, founding fathers and framers. But again, that's minor nitpicking stuff. That's really all not that important, but it stuns me. It's always stunned me how many people write best-selling books about the U.S. Constitution and appear on Fox News and CNN and da 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 da, and who don't know the difference. I mean, it's always stunned me. I mean, the nation's leading intellectuals get it wrong all day, every single day. But it's
Yeah.
still a minor point.
I want to bring back up what we were kind of talking before before I forgot to hit the record button about, because I feel like this is something that, I mean, really all of academia in the United States should just be ashamed that they don't know about how the Bill of Rights. I mean, it just we should, right? Because if you don't know history,
Yes.
you're doomed to repeat it.
Well, yeah, if you don't know the history of the Bill of Rights, you will never, ever, ever understand the Constitution. And I think very, very convincingly. Your audience may be shocked, but you've already been there. I believe No, I know deep in my soul. If you ask 100 million Americans tomorrow, was the creation of the Department of Education a legitimate, legal, constitutional act? Every single one of them will say, well, of course it was, because I'm reading the Bill of Rights and I say, I'm reading the Bill of Rights. The government can't tell you who to worship, can't take your guns, can't stifle the press, can't quarter troops in your home. I don't see anything here that says the government will not establish a Department of Education. Therefore, it's 100% legal, constitutional, and beautiful. That is pure nonsense. That is how the Bill of Rights destroyed the U.S. Constitution. And I do mean destroyed it. Before the Bill of Rights, you would not go to the bill. You would not go to the Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights came 3.5 years after the U.S. Constitution. Before the Bill of Rights was created, when someone asks you, is the Department of Education constitutional? If someone asked you, is the Department of Education constitutional? You would have gone to not the Bill of Rights because it didn't exist yet. You would have gone to Article 1, Section 8. You would have gone to the enumeration and looked at the powers that the framers gave to the federal government. And you would look at those powers and you would say, okay, the power to raise an army, the power to print money, the power to secure the border, the power to have customs. And you'd have said, no, I don't see the word education here whatsoever. The federal government does not have the power to establish the Department of Education. Quote one of the presidents in the book. Well, I quote James Madison, and he says, I forget what program specifically he was talking about, but James Madison says, speaking of welfare spending, he said, I cannot place my finger upon that part of the U.S. Constitution that allows me to spend constituents' money on benevolence to fellow citizens.
Right.
See, he read the enumeration and he was looking for permission to spend money on welfare. He did not find it. If he had gone to the Bill of Rights, he'd have been looking not for permission to spend the money. He'd have been looking for a specific prohibition that prevented him from spending the money. He would not find it, and your money would be spent. Franklin Pierce wrote almost the exact same words. There was a bill on his desk to give money to drought-stricken farmers. And he said, I cannot place my finger on that part of the Constitution that allows me to do this. That's because he looked at the enumeration. He was looking for permission to spend your money on welfare for farmers. He did not find it. If he had gone to the Bill of Rights, he would have been looking for a specific prohibition saying you cannot spend it. He would not have found it, and your money would have been taken. Before the Bill of Rights, you had every single right in the Bill of Rights, every single one, plus a billion others. After the Bill of Rights, you have only those listed in the Bill of Rights, and the federal government is now a leviathan that can take every single penny you own and send it to journalists in Sri Lanka to teach them not to use offensive non-binary language that would offend LGBTQ. The federal government can take every penny you own and spend it on virtually anything it wants at any time it wants for any reason whatsoever because of the Bill of Rights. And that's why the framers at the convention rejected the Bill of Rights overwhelmingly. 3 men spoke in favor of it. The state delegations rejected it unanimously. And it was written 3.5 years later by a different group of men in a different city, in a different state, in a political forum, and had absolutely nothing to do with the framers or the founders, period.
So, I mean, and this is, I guess, would be a natural question a lot of people would have, right? So there's certain things in there that, we all kind of take for granted, First Amendment, Second Amendment, yada, yada. Right. So how would that, because obviously, especially in today's day and age, that first and second one are like becoming more and more like,
Mhm.
I don't want to say like vital, right? But like the principle behind them so vital. How would we have a country ensured that people would have those same protections as individuals?
Well, again, very good question. Under the enumeration, before the Bill of Rights, the original Bill of Rights, the better Bill of Rights, Under the enumeration, you go and you read it, and again, the federal government has the power to secure the border, establish an army, print money, have a post office. There is absolutely positively no right, no power, no authority granted to the federal government to suppress free speech, take your guns, tell you who to worship, none of that. All of that stuff was already, the framers explained this in the Federalist Papers.
Right. Yeah,
You
true.
don't need a Bill of Rights because we've listed the powers of the federal government, and those powers are, quote, few and defined, and they do not touch your cherished liberties. They do not. So again, people think, again, every human being I've ever met, every single person I've ever talked to, including, I never talked to him, but I read his book, Justice Bork. Justice Bork gets it 100% completely wrong. People say, I'm going to look at the Bill of Rights. Can the federal government take 80% of my income, 90%, 95%, and send it to Sri Lanka to teach journalists how to be nice to LGBTQ? I'm looking at the Bill of Rights. I see no prohibition against that. Okay? So of course they can. That's how people think. Now, if you look at the enumeration, you ask yourself, can the government take even 1 penny of mine, 1/100th of a penny, 1/10000000th of my penny, and send it to Sri Lanka for any reason whatsoever? If you look at the enumeration, the answer is no, absolutely not. That's the difference between the Bill of Rights and the enumeration, and that's why the men who wrote the Constitution, the framers of the Constitution, said that the Bill of Rights is preposterous, unnecessary, and dangerous. Actually, that's two different reasons. Preposterous and unnecessary. Reason number one. Why is it unnecessary to say the government can't take your guns? Look at the enumeration. You don't see that power listed. That's why the Bill of Rights is unnecessary. Why? But much more importantly, why is it dangerous? Because if you list certain rights, a few rights, 10, 15, 20, you create the impression that those are all of the rights. And that's the world we live in today. Every politician who ever breathed thinks he can do anything all day, every day, as long as it does not offend the Bill of Rights. Every single one of them. In a nation of 330 million people, 329 million people also believe the same thing. People will talk about that writing that Doge uncovered, this thing about Sri Lanka. People will sit there and say, that spending is wasteful. It's ridiculous. It's stupid. It's insane. But they will never say it's unconstitutional because they don't know any better.
Right. Well, just while I'm thinking of that, I remember, I don't think it was either Jefferson or Adams or one of those. I forget which one it was. It could have been one, two of them that said which founding father said every generation should revisit the Constitution. And they wanted to put that in there like a mandatory, some sort of constitutional convention. It never made it in there because the vast majority were against that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'd have been necessarily for a full-fledged constitutional convention, but to some degree, I don't think that the principle behind that is necessarily wrong.
Mm-hmm.
From your research, how would something like that apply? Because in today's day and age, a lot of people feel like certain parts of the Constitution, I wouldn't say don't apply, right? But they don't fit like how the world seems to operate.
That's a very good question because that's 100% wrong too. People, if you believe, as everyone does, if you believe that the federal government is legally entitled to and should run your life and, quote, run the country, then yeah, wow, it was written 10,000 years ago. How relevant could it be? But that is simply absolutely false. The federal government under the U.S. Constitution, again, as James Madison said, will never touch your life unless times of war, extreme circumstances. The federal government, back in the day, you could live your entire life and never, ever, ever brush up against the federal government. They had the power to secure the border, have a post office, print money, boring, 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 boring power after boring power. The state governments had all the power to address modern day issues, you know, retirement income, driver's licenses, drinking age, etc. Whatever modern day issue that you want to think about was left to the states. This nonsense that the US Constitution is outdated is, well, nonsense.
Yeah,
It's just,
I don't think a lot of people are trying to say, well, let me rephrase it. There is a lot of people trying to say it's outdated. Maybe for coming from my perspective, there could be like certain parts. So, obviously we didn't have necessarily communism back then, right? Um, I think, Ronald Reagan, I thought didn't agree with him and everything, but I'm still very admiration of his approach to, kind of putting the clamp on it. You know what I mean? Obviously you can never
mhm.
completely eliminate it, but and my fear is, and I think a lot of people's fear would be, is would the would us going to such more of a hard line stance on that, would that put us in any sort of risk to address the problem, because we weren't in a direct physical war, right? But we were in a kind of like we are with China now, an economic war with the
Mhm.
Soviets. How would we be able to do that, just from like your perspective? Because people
Well,
think like that.
that's a good question. I think I'm hearing it correctly, but yes, the federal government under the US Constitution is 100% ready to address those things through tariffs. The federal government had the power, and for a very long time, virtually all of federal revenue is through tariffs.
Yes.
The federal government has the power to regulate international trade with the United States. It just does. And it also had the power to regulate interstate trade because the states were not going to be allowed to each basically set up their own separate nation. Virginia could not say, well, we're going to have a 30% tariff on stuff from Maryland, but a 3% tariff on stuff from North Carolina. So, as far as the dealing on the international stage, again, that was a prerogative of the federal government. As a matter of fact, the states were forbidden from doing any such thing.
Okay.
I think a lot of people want, so many people expect and want the Constitution to be perfect, and it's not, and it never will be, and it can't be. And they expect it to answer all their issues and wants, and that's just not going to be the case. But by God, it's pretty darn good.
Yeah.
And again, it left, the federal government to this day. I want the federal government to engage in international diplomacy with China. I don't want the state of Tennessee to do that.
Right. Right.
And I want okay. So, yes, to this very day, it remains highly, highly relevant. Flawed as it may be in some ways. Again, I don't fall into that trap. If you want me to say what I think is very wrong with the U.S. Constitution,
No,
I
no,
can
no,
do
not
so.
necessarily. I think it's just more because some people go, okay, I have this concern, right? Is where there is, maybe I'm thinking more in terms of the line, like I was talking earlier, libertarianism, right?
Mhm.
Libertarianism, like a hard line version of it, might put the federal government out of even doing something like that. Like if you really went like full fledged, because in their eyes, we shouldn't be doing anything of that nature unless there's an actual war, and
Yeah,
I think that's where some people may get that fear.
yeah, full bore, full fledged libertarianism. The libertarian candidate for president in the last election cycle believed in completely open borders,
Yeah,
and
it's a
I,
terrible idea.
I just don't know how that.
Outside of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, I don't really think most Democrats believe in completely open borders either.
Yeah, it's, well, I hope not.
Yeah,
You say you don't think they do? I
no,
hope you're right.
I know that the vast majority don't. For me, when it comes down to immigration, I take, again, going back to, I like the Ronald Reagan approach. You're kind of already, when he granted amnesty, right? A lot of these people came here through a program that essentially our last president put in place. And I'm not saying, hey, did they break a law? Yes, they did. No, I'm not denying that. But if they're here and they're doing farm work or they're working in a restaurant, they're
Mhm.
keeping their home clean per se, they're not some kind of penalty. Let's get them a work visa,
Yeah.
rather than spending all this revenue to
Reagan's
move them out.
amnesty, I think, at the time was defensible. Yeah, you can't. I mean, you could also easily say that it opened the gates, opened the door to, oh well, there has to be a limit. There
Well, yeah,
really, really has to be a limit. Yeah, that was potentially defensible because the problem at the time was not nearly, as near as I know, I was in 1986. I don't know. I was 20, 22. I don't think the problem is what it is now.
No,
No.
no, that's they, like when they're talking about it, you know, I guess I probably take a Republican approach, but from a different angle. Obviously, we need to control the border, but we need to go after these companies that are exploiting these illegal workers. And people are like, "Well, you're going after these people," and it's like, "No, we need to a degree, yes, but we need to go after the companies that are suppressing your wages." And these companies, by doing this, are subverting our labor laws. They're subverting the not the FTC. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank in the agency's name, but the Department of Labor, I should say,
Hmm.
by doing this, right? So they can sit there and go, people go, well, they pay. If I'm offering you $10 an hour and myself $10 an hour to work, right? But if you're illegal and I'm not, well, as an employer, you have to match their taxes when you
Yeah.
send them in. 99% of Americans do not realize that. So they don't realize that, let's say, quote unquote, this person pays taxes out of their check. Well, if they're here illegally, chances are that money's going right back into that company's pockets. They're not cutting the check. So it's just things like that. I live in, well, not, I'm a little south of Detroit now, but Detroit is a very, very heavy immigrant area, right? We have a
Yeah.
lot of Hispanics, Arabs. And I say, you go to Southwest Detroit, which is pretty much predominantly, we call it Mexican town, or, Southwest. And, you know,
Well,
d-
I'm in the DC area, so
Yeah, so Southwest Detroit's known for being a rough place, you know,
yes, it is.
but you can go to Southwest and walk the streets in a lot of the main areas there and feel no issue.
Hmm.
Like you can go to the restaurants, some of the shops, and you just don't feel that. Whereas if you were in other parts of the city, you might not feel so safe walking
Hmm.
into a restaurant there. I grew up in the city, so for me, I'm like, well, I know as long as I mind my own business, I'll be fine for the most part.
Yeah.
But, somebody from, outside town doesn't know that, and I mean, that's just kinda going off on, like, the Constitution and a lot of people don't realize the Alien Act was meant to prevent situations that we're in. I don't know, like, again, like, what was it? Early 1900s, was late 1800s when the populist movement really took hold in the United States, and
Yeah.
that
I'm gonna
changed
say
everything.
yeah. In 19. I'm gonna say 1900s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Roosevelt and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Teddy Roosevelt, he had a lot of I agree with a lot of what he did in principle, I just don't always agree with the way he did it.
Yeah. Well, my beef with Teddy was the when he ran for president the second time. That's way into the weeds. Very, very bad thing that he did. He sat out the whole election process. He came in late. The Republicans said, "Hey, look, we picked Joe over here. We picked him. You're great. You're beautiful. We love you. Give it 4 years, and you will be our candidate again." And he's like, "No, no, I can't wait 4 years." So he runs, splits the ticket, and puts Woodrow into the White House.
Yeah.
The only Virginian president I'm ashamed of, but whatever.
Yeah, yeah. Wilson is not the doll that history tries to
Yeah.
make him out to be.
No, no, he's
Yeah,
he's not my boy.
and this isn't like, knocking on FDR because, I'm not a big fan of his, but I feel at heart he felt what he was doing was the right thing for people.
Hmm.
But, the No Kings protests that are going on right now, I tell people, I'm like, well, there was two other people in our nation's history that were advocated to be made kings, even though that was never a big, never really went anywhere. George Washington
George.
and FDR.
Yeah.
There was actually a section of the country, enough for people to notice, that were advocating for FDR and his lineage to be our royal family here. And I was like, and people are like, no, that's not true. I'm like, no, it really is. Just like they don't talk about I mean, some people call them concentration camps, but we had camps during World War II for, immigrants and people, driving them. And I interviewed a young lady yesterday. Her name was Suzanne, and she did a lot of arms negotiations in the 80s. And we were just talking, and she's like, yeah, people just don't realize, they just don't get it. They don't get why we're at where we're at and how to fix it. They just, they're people are just stuck on, online, right? So part of like what I was going to ask you about is, as we quote unquote, they try, I believe in your book says change the conversation. Um, when you look at how discourse, right, has evolved, especially online. My gosh, I mean, I could say blue, you say black, and next thing you know, there's like 15 million comments about how we're the devil
Yeah.
reincarnated.
Yeah.
Do you think America's biggest issue in terms like, relate to the Constitution, right, is political division or intellectual laziness? Without calling
I
people themselves lazy, I should say.
Yeah, the biggest problem, back to my book. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
to
no,
me,
use it as a reference point. Yeah.
yeah, to me, the biggest problem is when dealing with the U.S. Constitution is it comes down to, I think, again, three things that nobody knows about the U.S. Constitution. One was the Bill of Rights.
Hmm.
Believe me, when I began this project, at least it's 19, at least 30 years ago. I'd stumble upon these things and I'd say, "My God, I can't believe I'm hearing this. I've never heard this before." And it's just a simple lack of knowledge. Here, let me give you an example. Number two in the book. If I were to tell you that John Adams said, "Right to X," I don't know. Maybe you've read the book. Maybe I'm, and
Parts of
maybe
it. I
you've read
read a little bit. Yeah.
the right to X is as sacred as the laws of God. Okay, as sacred as the laws of God. Another author said the framers reviewed the right to X in an almost religious capacity. Strike the word almost, because that's, as I just said, Adam said, as sacred as the laws of God, religious. The violation of the right to X was as alarming as the mark of the beast in Revelation. As sacred as the laws of God, as alarming as the mark of the beast. Another author said the framers almost always spoke of this right in starkly religious tones.
Yes.
What right would you think I was talking about?
Well, the as sacred of the laws of God. If I remember, I read some of it. It was talking about the money created by your body, and I forget the other two parts that were on there, but it's essentially the money created by your body from like your labor and your
Yes.
mind. I'm sorry, in your mind.
Your body, money created by
Yes.
your body, your labor, your soul, and your mind, something like that.
Yes.
The framers thought that your right to your money was the most important of all of your sacred, God given natural rights. The most important. I'll never, ever, ever forget my journey to this book started one day in a college class in Houston, Texas, and I was reading a book called "The People Shall Judge," and that book was chock full of 100,000 quotes from the framers and the founders both, and this book right here. And about 400 pages in, I said to myself, if the framers mentioned the word property one more time, I'm going to go hang myself. I'm tired of this mention, because to me, property meant landed estates. Okay, the professor held up his finger and he said, "Remember, property is money, or money is property." And of course, I found quotations from James Madison: "A man's property is his money." Okay. You, again, Google this in 10 seconds. The framers thought that, again, property comes from your mind, your body, your soul, your hands, your labor, was the most important of all the sacred God. It's not a civil right. Civil right is a voting and this, it's a natural right, the right to self-defense, the right to the framers mentioned property and money in the Federalist Papers 17 times more often than the big three rights of the First Amendment combined.
Wow.
Again, the moment the idea is introduced into society that property is not as sacred as the laws of God, said John Adams, anarchy and tyranny commence. America's first welfare program, which we'll discuss in a second, was described as alarming as the mark of the beast in Revelation. And I already told you, these other authors point out that the framers viewed property with an almost religious respect. And in the book, I say, no, scratch the word almost. There's nothing almost about it. Okay. Now, I need to be clear about this. I need to be very clear. When you enter into civil society and you escape the state of nature that John Locke described as nasty, brutish, and short, all of your rights are compromised. Every single one of them.
Yes.
You have the right to free speech. You do not get to criticize the government. in front of the old folks' home Sunday at 3 a.m. with a sound truck and bullhorns. You don't get to do that. You have the right to self-defense. You don't get to go to your murder trial and hear the verdict read with your fully loaded machine gun on the table in front of you. Okay? All of your rights are compromised. Americans believe and accept this. However, Americans seem to think that your property rights, you must pay taxes. You must. If you want to escape the dreaded state of nature, where, again, life is nasty, brutish, and short, you must have government and you must pay for it. Period. Taxes are legitimate, required, demanded. However, your property rights are exactly like all of your other sacred rights. Compromised minimally and only when necessary. The government can't stop you from saying the government sucks. And they also don't get to take every single penny that you've ever earned and dedicate it to any project, any crazy ass project they dream up, $8 million to journalists in Sri Lanka to teach them about non-binary offensive language or whatever. Property rights, yes, you compromise them when you enter into civil society, but you don't flush them down the toilet 100%. And that seems to be where we are in this country today. People will describe nonsensical, ridiculous, insane government spending as nonsensical, insane, ridiculous, wasteful, but never once in my entire life, ever, have I heard a human being describe that kind of wasteful spending as a violation of your sacred, God-given natural rights, every bit as important as your right to free speech. And the framers would have said, every bit as important as your rights to free speech. And again, I have in the book is 80% quotations.
Right. No,
And
it should be a mandatory reading for college and high
the
school.
framers go on and on and on and on about property and its sacred nature. I have never found a quotation where the framers say something like, your right to free speech is as sacred as the laws of God. Never. And let me give you, to me, it may be the most important single example in the entire book about the framers' burning obsession with protecting your money. We talked about this, I think, before the podcast went live. The framers ratify the convention, the Constitution. The Constitution is the law of the land.
Yes.
Even after the Bill of Rights, and your viewers can look this up. They can Google this in 10 seconds. The Bill of Rights applies to the federal government and the federal government alone. None of the restrictions of the Bill of Rights apply to the states. So let me read you this quotation again, which I think your listeners did not hear. This is from Novus Ordo Seclorum, written by Forrest McDonald, I believe, in 1985. This is the state of the powers of the various states after the Bill of Rights, after the Constitution has been ratified, after the Bill of Rights has been ratified. Here's the powers that the states maintained. Most of the colonies had tax-supported churches. All, except Rhode Island, imposed legal restrictions on various religious sects and penalties for dissenters, apostates, and blasphemers and idolaters were numerous and severe. The states could establish the mode and manner of religious worship and instruction, and they could levy taxes for the support of religion, and they could stifle dissent, stifle freedom of the press, of inquiry, of speech. They could regulate food and drink and clothing for the purposes of religious or moral instruction. However, we will get to the third very, very, very significant thing in my book. They could do all that, but what were the states forbidden from doing? That is what's incredibly, breathtakingly important. The states were no longer allowed to steal money from people for welfare programs. That's the third. The Bill of Rights is the first thing in my book that nobody knows. The fact that the framers thought the sweat-stained, grubby, filthy little dollar bills in your pocket are sacred gifts from the Almighty himself. That's number two. The third thing is, why do we even have a Constitution? What exactly led to the creation of the Constitution? And that thing is America's first welfare. The United States of America defeated the British, you're out of here, 1781, I believe, at Yorktown. Most people think that the U.S. Constitution was written because, well, the Brits are gone, we need a new government. Completely false. The United States had existed under the Articles of Confederation during the war and for 6, 7 years after the war. So why do we have a U.S. Constitution? The book quotes the anti-federalists explaining, well, the only reason that these men, the anti-federalists, they don't want the Constitution, they don't want the convention, they don't like James Madison. The only reason these men are calling this constitutional convention is because of the paper money welfare crisis. They use those words, welfare crisis, that is sweeping the states. Keep that in mind, paper money welfare crisis. James Madison wrote an essay, big fat essay, 3,100 words, and it was called Vices of the United States Political System before the convention. The purpose of this essay was to lay out the vices of the U.S. political system that led to the convention, that made the convention necessary. Here are the screwed up things in our country that make a U.S. constitutional convention, a new government, necessary. He listed 12 vices. Paper money was the first of those vices. It took up 1,200 words of a 3,100 word essay. Paper money, a crisis that you never ever heard of, and no other living, breathing American has ever heard of, is the reason we have the U.S. Constitution. Paper money was a welfare scheme, and the founders were horrified, disgusted, and terrified by it. Again, remember that quotation from Roger Wilson, Pennsylvania delegate to the convention, talking about paper money as being as alarming as the mark of the beast in Revelation. What was paper money? Very simple. Farmers dominate the politics of every state because they're at least 90% of the population of every single state. Farmers, to this very day, the same problem exists. You have to borrow a lot of money up front. Then you plant and hope for the best. Farmers are in debt. They borrow from creditors. They borrow gold and silver coins. Contracts specify you will pay me back in gold and silver coins. Farmers have this brilliant idea. I'm not so crazy about that. I'm going to pay you back in paper money. So the 900 farmers go to the state legislator, and remember, there are 900 farmers. There may be one creditor, and they say, you're going to print paper money, and you're going to make it legal for the repayment of debts. And the state legislator says, well, there are 900 of you, and there are 2 creditors. So yeah, I'm all on board. You will print paper money that we will take nearly worthless, inflating even as it comes off the printing press, and we will pay back our debts with this paper money. Creditors say, nah, I'm not taking that. Oh, okay, we'll pass another law. You will take it. Yes, you will. Creditors, especially in only one state, refused to send delegates to the U.S. to the convention, Rhode Island, because they were the very, very, very worst of the paper money offenders. In Rhode Island, they passed another law. Okay, the creditor has fled the state. He has left the state of Rhode Island so that he doesn't have to stand on the street corner and take this worthless paper money in repayment of the debt. Think about that for a minute. People say that the rich, the creditor class, will always take care of themselves and have nothing to fear. America in the 1780s, no matter how wealthy you were, no matter how rich, the power of the mob to steal from you was overwhelming. The creditors fled their state. They left their homes to avoid taking the paper money. And you know what the Rhode Island government did? They said, okay, here's the latest law. Law number 3. If you owe money to a creditor and he's gone, you take that worthless paper money, you take it to a bank, you slap it on the counter, and you take out an ad in a newspaper saying, I've paid this debt, the debt's canceled. The Supreme Court of the state of Rhode Island said that's unconstitutional. The legislature, okay, you're all fired. And then they put in a brand new Supreme Court. The framers looked at this, and this is happening all over the country. Rhode Island was the worst. The framers looked at this and they said, we can't have this. We cannot have this. This is a violation of the sacred property rights of when the framers speak of the minority, who are they speaking of? Almost always the minority. The minority must be protected. They're speaking of people with money.
Right. Yeah. The wealthy.
At the convention, the framers said, the problems that we have right now flow from the evils of an excess of democracy. That is why the U.S. Constitution was written. In any government system, those who are in power, the majority, the minority, the oligarch, the king, the this, the that, those in power will oppress those without. Under the U.S. Constitution, the common man, the majority, the less well off, they have the lion's share of the power, as it should be. Therefore, under the U.S. Constitution, checks and balances are directed against the common man. James Madison said, the Republican principle, meaning you don't have any votes, the Republican principle assures us that the rich people are not going to take over the world. The Republican principle. The Senate is meant as a check on the people. That's the third thing in my book that most people know is that the U.S. Constitution exists to crush a welfare program. Period. Read the book. The U.S. Constitution came into existence to crush a welfare program, the paper money welfare program. The fourth thing in the book is, and I have two quotations on this, at least two, checks and balances, also misunderstood. People think that checks and balances, okay, there are a bunch of bad senators and they're going to screw the people. Aha, they'll be checked by the House or the president. Okay, there's a bunch of congressmen, they're going to screw the people. Aha, they're going to be checked by the Supreme Court or the president. No. Checks and balances, as Madison and Jefferson both say, are directed almost entirely against the people. As they say, checks and balances are not meant to curb illegal usurpations of power to oppress the people. Checks and balances are designed to keep politicians not from screwing the people, but to keep them from giving to the people exactly what it is that they want. Because so often, what the people want, just like any other group you could care to name, so often what those in power want is the money of somebody else. That's why checks and balances exist.
Yeah, I mean, everybody always wants to put their hand in someone else's pocket. That just seems to be like a natural,
Yes.
a natural function of a lot of people.
Yeah. Yes.
So,
No.
kind of like talking about your book a little bit, right? When we talk about the money part, the gold standard per se that we were on, I think it's how you pronounce it, the Breton system or Brenton system, like
The Bretton Woods.
Bretton Woods system, yeah. There's, to me, from my knowledge, there's really not enough gold that we can get our hands on to support that system in today's economy. But there's other metals that or items we could go after rather than the pie in the sky currency. And I tell people, I'm like, the biggest, they always want to point at all these other things that are really crushing our standard of living in the middle class. Are the debt is what's killing us, and the debt kills us because in a fiat system, the debt reflects the government, per se, rather than if we were under a metal system or something backing it. Well, yeah, the government could run a $5 trillion deficit, but as long as we had some way of, making that reserves work, we would be just like we were 30, 40 years ago. People would be like, that's fine, but they've got something to back it.
I think Milton Friedman made that point very well. He said, if you have a metal-based system, they would cheat. They would, add tin or something. There is a limit in a metal-based system. There's always a limit to how much you can cheat. With a printing press, there's no limit whatsoever. You take a $1 bill, 50 zeros. Add 100 zeros, add 150,000 zeros. Yes, yeah. I think it would be better if we were on a metal-based system. Yeah, it limits the amount of borrowing. It limits the amount of money that can be pumped.
Well, yeah, and you knowing a lot about obviously the earlier government. I don't necessarily if he was one of my favorite presidents, but definitely made a lot of actions that I did a lot of things in office. Andrew Jackson.
I knew it. I knew you were going to say Jackson when you said that. I knew it. Yeah, he was a very energetic man. Yes, he was.
He did a lot of things that I think if people actually took some of the not so good things he did out of it and just looked at the principle behind his policies as president, first paid off. I think he's the only president in history to ever have the U.S. government debt free completely. Because he sold a bunch of land and stuff. And if I'm correct, the U.S. government was pretty much debt free. And he was the only president in our nation's history that killed off a central bank. It was the Bank of the United States. He let the charter expire and wouldn't sign a new one.
Yeah,
and he said
Supreme Court, that was a big early Supreme Court case.
Yeah, and he said the central bank hurts the little guy. He was in today's words, he would be he's a man of the
populist.
People. Yeah. he cared about the little guy. Like he said, that local guy selling fruit on the side of the road is being hurt by this bank that's giving these wealthy people all this money at next to no rate, and then turning
Mhm.
around and robbing poor people per se. It was a presidential version, I guess, if you want to call it a Robin Hood. And I really appreciated that aspect from because I tell people I'm like, the problem now is the government can spend everything it wants to make your life better. But if they don't have a way to pay for it, all it's going to do is make your $20 now buy about 50 cents worth of product. To where if they balanced it out more, your $20 would now be able to buy more product.
Well, if the federal government, if all it is never ever going to happen. I'm not delusional. Okay,
Right.
it's never going to happen. But if the federal government simply respected the enumeration, the very very limited powers it was given, I forget who wrote this. For the first 150 years of this country, the average federal percentage of GDP was 2.5%, 1.5. The average. Now we're at 20. Back in the day, if the federal government ever ran a surplus, they had no idea what to do with the money because I've got $1 million here and I can't find a constitutional reason to spend it. I have no idea what I'm going to do with this money because the Constitution won't let me spend it. If the federal government simply respected its limits, this would not be an issue. Now, again, I'm not delusional. A lot of very conservative people, the 10 of them in this country who know about the enumeration, said, well, we have to get back to the enumeration. It's never going to happen. But if
Right.
it did, we wouldn't have this problem.
No.
We wouldn't. Well, 60% of the federal government, unless I'm mistaken, you can check these numbers change. 60% of the federal government budget is welfare, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, welfare.
Yeah. It's
And
those.
they're all welfare. I've paid in Social Security, but I will probably get back way, way, way more than I put in. Well, who knows at this point? But, all of these things are unconstitutional. They just are. That's 60% of the budget. Unconstitutional. So, yes, when you talk about spending and debt, the framers had the answer. Now, if the state of Massachusetts or Texas or whatever wants to, tax its citizens into bankruptcy, that was another glory, of the federalist system. The other 50 states would see this and say, well, we're not doing that.
Right.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
it's not going to happen, but it would be nice.
Well, and it's why I kind of, why I like, some of what I had read is, to me, a big part of it is so in Michigan here, we now have a record amount of money being spent per pupil on students, right? But they did this, and it was bipartisan support, which I'm not against it, right? Because it was people that a lot of Michiganders who were like, hey, we want this, we want that, we want certain things for our kids. And they respected, the thing. And they knew, obviously the changes coming from the Obamacare subsidies and all that. And the state stepped in and said, okay, hey, we're going to protect certain things for you. Make sure, you can afford to get your health insurance next month, all those things, right? But they did it at the state level. And
Yeah.
that's why I tell people I'm like, a state government is far better equipped to take care of your problems in your area than some person all the way in DC who, I mean, unless you made the TV cameras, would not even know you exist.
Oh, yes, yes. I think there's an entire chapter on this, the federalism things. Who is best equipped to handle the crime problems in Des Moines? The people, natives, government, et cetera, of Des Moines, or the feds in DC?
Right. Yeah. No,
Um, is is it's just a wonderful, wonderful system. This idea, I can't begin to imagine any reason whatsoever that the people of Iowa, they gather up $100, they send it to DC, it comes back to them minus a handling fee, minus the part that goes to a state that doesn't pay as much. Okay, I sent $100 to DC, I get back $90. And that $90 is, you better spend the money in this way. What in the name of God do the people of Iowa get from that? They have less money and instructions on how to spend their money directed by DC. Are there philosopher king gods in DC who knew better than the people of Iowa what that money should have been spent on?
right.
That that alone in the federal system is so incredibly obviously clear to me. Back in the day, crime control, I use that as an example in the book because most people would think that, oh my God, certainly crime control, that must be constitutional. No, it's not constitutional. The states handle their own crime and criminals and policies. They don't need the wisdom of the philosopher God kings in Washington, D.C. The people of Iowa or Texas or Massachusetts or Virginia do not need the input from the federal reps from California on how to handle their crime problems. They don't need it. They don't want it. And, I think I wrote in the book, even if somehow in a miraculous, ungodly coincidence, DC sends back to Iowa with $100 and says, X, Y, and Z, and the people in Iowa wanted to do X, Y, and Z. Oh my God. It's a clean. What was the point? What is the point?
Yeah, there isn't. I mean, it's we were talking like you talked about the Department of Education earlier, and it really made me think about and what you were saying. It just made pop into my head is before the United States had the Federal Department of Education, we had the best K through 12 system in the world. And as soon and people are like, well, we need. Listen, I'm not against to where if a state is having some kind of crisis, the federal government says, okay, hey, temporarily we help you shore things up. I mean, I know it's something of that nature, right? But when it was controlled by the parents, by the states, by the people who had to, that representative that had to go pick their kid up from school, they had to look at their constituents in the eye and go, hey,
Right.
and so they were more accountable to make sure the things you wanted done got done.
Yeah. And of course, people will point out correctly that the states can and will screw things up. But every time someone's ever come to me with that argument, there seems to be a supposition behind it that, well, the federal government can't and won't. Of course, the states can screw things up. And your solution is let the federal government be in control because God knows they can never screw anything up. That's simply not permissible by God or human nature. So, yeah, I
Yeah,
just don't get it.
yeah, it's and people go, oh, and I guess it's kind of like that thing, right? You're like a 25-year-old, went out on your own, thought you had it all figured out. All of a sudden, you're broken your belly up, right? Who's the first people you look to? Hey, mom and
Yeah.
dad. And I think that's kind of how, not like necessarily like a nanny state, right? But to a degree, yeah. They look to the federal government like, hey, mom and dad, I screwed up, help me out.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And and to a degree, yes, but it's gotten very perverted from even how the people that originally wanted some of these things 100 years ago wanted. It's
Well,
just been destroyed.
the other problem is, and again, the number of educated, intelligent people that I've heard say this, if I hit $1 for every time that somebody said, if the state of Virginia doesn't like Virginia or the Fed's XYZ policy, they don't have to take that federal money. And I'm like, whoa, what federal money? Where did the feds get that money? They took it from Virginia to start with. There is no such thing. There's not one penny, not 1/1000th of a penny of federal money anywhere. Where do they get the money? They get it from the states.
Yes.
If North Dakota doesn't like federal government 55-mile-an-hour speed limit, they don't have to take that Department of Transportation money. And that DOT money came from God, Zeus. Where did that money come from? It came from the people of the state of North Dakota. Again, North Dakota sends $50 to DC. DC sends back 45 and says, here's your new speed limit.
Right. Yes.
Pardon? What?
I don't think people
So, yeah.
realize how they got when they had lowered the age of drinking, and then when they raised it back up, how they strong arm states how to do it is they said, if you don't change your drinking age, because a lot of people, I don't think they may not realize it, but drinking ages are generally set by the states.
They should be.
But they said if you don't put it at 21, we're going to withhold road funding dollars from you.
Yeah.
And
And where did
that's
those road dollars come from?
from us.
Yes, from the very state
Yeah.
that wants to have its own laws.
Yeah. And I
The
don't think,
number of I that's one of the things I saw at least 100 years ago. A man on the street interview, a man, in New York City, a man in a business suit. Yes, I think the federal government should pay for this as long as the taxpayer doesn't have to. Again, that money from God. that the federal government has that they dispense, like fairy dust. Yeah, that's yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, and kind of goes back to, speaking of fairy dust, the one politician in our country's history that did not want to be a politician that wanted to do George Washington. He literally
George.
wanted nothing to do with anything like this whatsoever. People don't realize he only literally became the president because, I mean, strong armed into it to a degree. He felt a duty to it, but he was
He
wretched
was
at the
always
idea.
he was always eager to get back to Mount Vernon, and I live in Virginia. And if you've ever seen Mount Vernon, you'll know why he wanted to get back to Mount Vernon.
Yeah,
I'd want to get back there too.
yeah, I'm a Freemason. I've been to the George Washington Memorial in
Hmm.
Virginia there, and that is man, that is a beautiful thing. And most Masonic lodges they have, picture George Washington up there. People don't realize Benjamin Franklin was the first Grand Master in the United States.
Well, I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah. It was definitely I learned some of that stuff. And, yeah, I mean these guys really like a lot of what they did and some of their principles came from what they had learned through passed down. Some of our systems of jury trials, things like that, were kind of they copied it.
Yeah, there's nothing extraordinarily new about the U.S. government system. It came from English Common Law, except the federalism principle.
Yes.
The federalism principle is, yeah, I think that's the biggest gift.
Do you think there's ever a chance we'll be able to go back to more of a federalist system compared to where we're at?
It would take 100 years at least. I mean, it took hundreds of years to get here. Theoretically, the pendulum could start swinging back, but no, I honestly, I am a big Mark Stein devotee, John Derbyshire. I think the country's absolutely doomed. I think Western civilization is actually absolutely doomed. I see no hope whatsoever.
Yeah.
Sorry,
You,
sorry to be Debbie Downer.
I feel the same. There's a part of me that feels the same way. And then, after Charlie Kirk was, I mean, won't even go into that. What a disaster and tragedy that was. But I started doing, because all of a sudden, churches were filling up again. And, and churches are still pretty full over a month later.
Hmm.
It really spiritually reawakened America, but not just people of middle age and older. It really reawakened the youth.
Yeah, you just can never tell. I mean,
Yeah, the
it's
youth. Well, here's the crazy thing. So now millennials and baby boomers are going to church at a lower rate than Gen Z, the latest generation of coming of age. Gen Z is 12 points more conservative from 18 years to 21 years than the previous two generations.
yeah. Believe me, I have seen those numbers and been amazed. And you heard how negative I am, so I'm amazed and stunned at those numbers. But just one of the tests. There's the cultural test. There's the financial test. Get back to me the day that the federal government spends less next year than it did this year. I mean, it's never, never,
Fair point. Fair point. Yeah, that's
never.
well, that's why Elon Musk left Doge.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I forget where I read it. Someone pointed out the National Review, the entirely predictable sad end of Doge. One thing that's still good. The vast majority of all federal spending in this country still comes from Congress, as it should. And so if Doge has the president's ear, the president cannot and should not be able to say, we're going to spend this and not going to spend this. It comes from Congress. And now we're back to Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, welfare. So yeah, it was predictable that Doge would fail. It was absolutely predictable, for many reasons. First, you're not going to turn off the welfare spigot. Never.
No, I mean that's just
It's go back to the Constitution. The farmers in Rhode Island were never, ever, ever going to turn off that welfare spigot ever. It took the U.S. Constitution to make paper money. I think did I make that point?
yeah.
Under the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 10 lists the very, very, very few things the states are not allowed to do. The very few things. You can't have your own army. You can't have your own. You can't engage in international diplomacy. You can't act as a separate nation state. The one and only thing that the states were not allowed to do that had direct bearing on their citizens, their population, was no more paper money. no impairing of contracts, no making anything but gold and silver legal repayment of debt. Dot, 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 dot. I think back to that point. Again, the states could tell you what to wear because you don't want to dress too gaudily because that puts you away from God. The states can tell you what to wear and eat and drink, but no more paper money welfare. So yes, the welfare spigot is never going to be turned off ever. I don't see any hope whatsoever. Even the most radical, maybe that's the wrong word. Reagan didn't begin to lay a finger on entitlement spending.
No.
Trump, the tornado, not a finger on entitlement, not even talking about it. Wake me up on the day that a president even talks about the entitlement spending, let alone something happens. So yeah, I just don't see it.
Yeah, it's I don't know if we'll ever get away from that, but I guess for me the hope is maybe as being a Christian or just the fact that what you when you turn on you see the media right and the things that we've talked about, and then you look at this younger generation coming up, and
Yeah,
they don't have necessarily the values that we would want them to have in that aspect, but they're also not as crazy and like so far off the base that
it sounds like
TV
very
makes
good
them out to
news.
be.
It sounds like very good news.
Yeah,
It
and
really does.
Yale did a study on it, and a lot of it came from them kind of coming of age, if you want to call it, during COVID and Biden era. And they were like, wow, all this, because you got to remember, all they seen was stimulus checks getting sent to you.
Hmm.
And then they started seeing prices going up. So they're seeing all these things in the negative that's happening. And they're probably the first generation since the Great Depression that actually seen the effect of what government policy can do and really hurt their daily lives, compared to where if Trump now says, hey, we're going to do this, well, the state can come in and kind of subsidize it, or,
Yeah,
this.
as negative as I am, those are very very hopeful signs that I'm really surprised me that the young people would feel this way. So I hope that I
It
am wrong.
shocked me, man. Let me tell you, when I read it, my job, my wife wasn't at home. She was at work in her office, like 40 minutes away. I called her. I'm like, did you know this? I'm like, and she's like, I'm at work. I'm like, I know, but this is like life altering to me. And she's like, calm down. I'm like, yeah, but when you turn on CNN, any news channel, even Fox News, you would not think that this is the case.
No, no, absolutely not.
And
Yeah.
for the
So
first time in probably since we've recorded it, out of obviously probably, a point we didn't, more young men now are going to church voluntarily than being dragged by their spouse or their girlfriend. Yeah. So, but Rick, I really appreciate, you coming on today, man. And everybody, you definitely need to pick up his book, Money and Liberty. I'm going to finish reading the rest of it.
are we again? We are audio or we are video, right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, let me hold it up.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, if you really want to, because there's a couple things Rick has taught me that I had zero idea about.
Only only 35,000 words.
Yeah, and Rick, what you've done is, I mean, to me, like, you got to figure out a way to get this into college classrooms on constitutional education somehow, some way.
Oh, no, believe me, I'm working on it. And I want to thank you, by the way. I'm going to thank because, I've been published, I wrote fiction and I sold it to New Line Cinema.
Hmm.
Okay. First thing I ever wrote in my entire life. I was the co author on nonfiction, sold to St. Martin's Press. And so I've had some success in this world, but, you know, well over 20 years of trying to get this book out there and just absolutely positively nothing but futility, nothing but futility. So anytime anybody ever actually listens to me and just say, please, just say, that's interesting. Believe me, I'm in your debt for simply saying that's interesting as opposed to,
Well, it's no different than this podcast. Most successful shows these days that talk about anything, you're either far left or you're far right. And you just shout as loud as you can. And there's a bunch of people that like what you have to say. And that's how, and I'm sitting there and I'm going, there's got to be something different.
yeah.
And
And that's a very important point because I don't know if I was clear enough about this. The Constitution allows every single individual state to be as far left or as far right as they want to be. This book absolutely mostly appeals to conservatives because, first of all, it says that money is a sacred right. Okay. It appeals to conservatives. But the state of Massachusetts, under the US Constitution, is absolutely free to be as liberal as it wants to be. And they can enact 100 welfare programs. They can't enact a paper money welfare program specifically, but they can enact 100 others. So there are things in this book for liberals and conservatives. I'd like to say that, though I will freely admit that it probably appeals to conservatives more than liberals. But
You know,
the truth is the truth. I'm sorry.
any liberal out there that is not closed off, definitely check things out, because I think that a lot of liberals would be surprised at how much the Constitution actually gives them the freedom to do what they want to do at the state level
That's very
without
true.
with way less complication and way less
Mhm.
red tape than there is at the federal level.
That's absolutely true.
I mean, case in point where that can go bad, California. Case in point where that can go right, to me, Michigan, but I could be biased because I live here. I mean, obviously Detroit has seen better days, but good times are coming. Apple's downtown Detroit now. They opened up a two-story store. Nike's down there. They moved up.
The Lions are,
Oh man, don't get me going on that game last Sunday night.
well,
That
with
was
that playoff loss 2 years ago.
I. I was at the playoff loss last year. This is my first time in 15 years I haven't had season tickets.
Oh, wait a second. Wait a second. The playoff last year was to the Commanders, right?
Yeah, and I was
Yeah,
there. I was like,
you guys were favored by a lot.
yeah, and I'm just sitting there and I'm just watching, and then I'm like, oh my god, I'm like, and I thought about selling my tickets, and then I didn't, and I kind of wish to a degree I had, but I'm glad I got to go. But then my tickets went from $2,600 to $5,000 for 3 seats in the nosebleeds, and my wife's like, I know you love the Lions, but they
More
doubled.
than me?
You're right. They doubled your prices again, and I'm like,
Jeez. My advice for the Lions, which is advice for the same advice I have for the Vikings. The Lions won 8 NFL championships in the 50s. 8? Was
yeah,
that right?
no, no, four in the 50s, and then a couple, I believe, in the 40s off the top of my head.
Okay. Go back outside, ditch the dome, get on grass. That's my advice to all NFL teams.
Yeah, I mean, Dan Campbell. I mean, quick. I don't know if you know, he was actually on the 0-16 team. He was a player. So the
Wow.
fact that
The
a guy
first team
from
ever to go with 0-18,
yeah,
right?
and he's leading the Lions to Super Bowl contenders, and it's like, if there was just ever like a pendulum of life, I mean, who would have ever really thought a guy from the 0-16 team would be leading the Lions to relevancy?
I didn't know that. I bet my son did. My son's more up on this.
Yeah, I mean, hey, the Lions they're gonna get there, hopefully. They seem to, for once, and actually probably my whole lifetime, actually have competent leadership from top to bottom, not just here and there. And they've made I believe they've gotten Barry Sanders back in the fold. They've got
Oh,
Calvin.
really?
Yeah, he's kind of like a special assistant to, like, in
Yeah,
the
yeah,
office type of
like
thing. And
Jim Brown was for Cleveland.
yeah, and
Yeah.
they've got Calvin Johnson comes almost every game now, and he's involved with the team. Was Chris Spielman, one of their famous
Uh-huh.
line.
Yeah.
He's essentially like the right hand person to the owner now, Sheila Ford. And she actually, when she took the team from her mom, she flew down to, I think, either Cincinnati, I believe is where he was living, went to his front door, didn't tell him she was coming, knocked on his door to get him to come and work for her.
Oh, well.
And that was kind of like the start. And I don't know if you know who his brother is, Rick Spielman.
Spielen's brother? No.
Rick Spielman, he ran the Vikings that drafted Adrian Peterson, built those competitive teams. And so he kind of brought him in, and then they brought the guy who drafted Patrick Mahomes and Baker Mayfield, John Dorsey. So yeah, they actually said, you know what, let's go out and find some people that know what they're doing, because we obviously don't. And I'm like, yeah,
Matt Millen. Bring him back.
I seen an ESPN 30 for 30 thing when he drafted Charles Rogers over DeMarcus Ware. He said when he got home, his son punched him in the face. And I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, hey, how embarrassing would that be,
Yeah.
But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, Rick. I'll send.
Not as much as I appreciate you for having me. Trust me on that.
Oh yeah, no, I'll give me a couple days. I'll send you over all the links and everything.
Yeah, when will this get posted?
Usually about 2.5 weeks out
Oh,
from
okay.
posting. I'll get all that information over to you. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, naturally, bring them up. All right. Thank you, Rick. And I appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day.